We're very happy today to have a superb program on the U.S. banking regulators recently announced Basel Endgame capital requirement proposal and the new long-term debt proposal. We have assembled two excellent panels of financial regulatory experts who will discuss the potential impacts of these proposals and how banking organizations could respond to them. We want to thank our co-sponsor, the New York State Bar Association. In our view, every banking organization should understand these two proposals, as they could potentially shape the industry for decades to come. The Basel Endgame proposal would establish new capital requirements for all banking organizations with more than $100 billion in assets. As originally conceived, the Basel Endgame was supposed to focus on improving the granularity of capital requirements and implement other technical changes adopted by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. However, as issued by U.S. banking regulators this past July, the Basel proposal would result in an increase in risk-weighted assets by nearly 20% at applicable banking organizations. Further, the proposal would largely create uniform capital requirements for these institutions, removing a tailored approach that had previously applied a more complex model-based approach for the largest globally significant banking organizations and a simpler approach for other institutions. It would also change how capital is set for trading activities, including new capital requirements for operational risk, and change risk weights across the board, including for mortgages. As if that wasn't enough, U.S. banking regulators have also recently proposed a long-term debt requirement for all banking organizations with more than $100 billion in assets other than the GSIBs, which are already subject to a total loss absorbency requirement. The proposal aims to make it easier for the FDIC to resolve banking organizations without imposing losses on uninsured depositors. Together, the Basel Endgame and long-term debt requirement proposal, if finalized, would impact the capital structure of many of the most significant banking organizations in the U.S. Now, with that, let me move to our first panel. Our first panelist is Dr. Guowei Zhang. Dr. Zhang is the Managing Director and Head of Capital Policy at SIFMA, where he is responsible for coordinating SIFMA's actions on capital policy issues. Prior to joining SIFMA, Dr. Zhang was a risk expert on capital policy at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. He co-authored the Basel III Consolidated Framework. He has also held memberships on Basel Risk Market Group and the Basel Credit Risk and Large Exposure Group. Dr. Zhang has a PhD in finance and master's degree in applied mathematics and computer science. Our next panel, moving to our right, is Professor David Zering, who is the Elizabeth F. Putzler Professor in Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department at the Wharton School. He writes at the intersection of financial regulation, international law, and domestic administration. He has written over 50 articles, including publications in the Chicago, Cornell, Michigan, NYU, and Virginia Law Reviews, and a number of international law journals. He is the author of the Globalized Governance of Finance. He has also testified on financial regulation before Congress on multiple occasions and wrote an occasional column on the subject for the New York Times Deal Book. Our final panelist is my colleague and partner here at Mayer Brown, Matt Bizantz, who is a partner in our financial services regulatory and enforcement practice. He has experience advising financial institutions on core bank regulatory issues and regulatory developments affecting complex financial instruments and significant cross-border transactions. He has previously worked at the SEC, the CFTC, DOJ, and the FDIC in regulatory and investigative roles. And I think pretty significant for this conversation, prior to law school, Matt worked as a certified public accountant. So with that, let's see. So for today's discussion, I want to start off with the changes in the trading book, which are some of the most significant changes to the capital requirements. Guowei, why don't I start with you? Can you briefly give us an overview of what changes are in the proposal and talk about some of the potential impacts that these changes could have on banks' trading operations?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew, for the great introduction. And then what I'll say today is, sorry, can you hear me now? Good, thank you. So what I'll say today is my personal view. It doesn't necessarily reflect the view of my SIFMA colleagues nor SIFMA's members. As Andrew mentioned earlier, the FRTB, which is one key component of what's called Basel III Endgame, will be the new framework to capitalizing banks' capital market activity. There are a number of technical changes. If people are interested, I'm more than happy to get into the weeds later on or after this event. But at the very high level, it basically completely rewrites the current market risk capital framework. And the end result is you will see if the proposal as proposed gets implemented, you will see a roughly 75% increase relative to where we are now on banks' capital market activity. And that's for the market risk piece alone. And as Andrew mentioned earlier, the overall Basel III package proposal is expected to increase banks' capital by roughly 20%. I just want to share a couple facts, which I'm sure you all know, that currently the US capital market funds about 75% of all US economic activities. And banks are a very instrumental intermediaries as a group collectively in this market. For example, if we look at primary dealers of US Treasury cash securities, over 3/4 of the dealers are bank affiliated entities. They are the ones subject to the new market risk rule or the FRTB. So as a result of the significant capital increase, I think perhaps it's reasonable to expect reduced product and service offerings by banks, and also the higher cost for end users and consumers like you and me, and more so, but perhaps a lower capital market liquidity. And the question is whether such a significant increase is warranted. And there, I'd like to point to a few facts. In recent few years, the Federal Reserve's SR reports have consistently characterized banks' levels as, and I quote, strong, robust, and at high levels. And as you all know, Fed former Vice Chair Dan Tarullo, who is a strong proponent of strong capital regulation, recently stated that he thinks risk-based capital for banks should be, and I quote, mid-teens, 14 or 15%. And he also indicated that his view now is stress testing, which is a significant driver of the reported capital increase, should be used as a tool to provide supervisors information regarding banks' resilience, not tying directly to capital requirement. And another very helpful study put out by PwC recently, looking at bank capital, they concluded the optimal level should be around just about 15%. Now, if we look at where banks are today, their capital level on average is about 15.2%. So right around the optimal level. Given the 20% further increase, that brings us to about 18.25% capital requirement if the proposal gets implemented. And as I alluded to, the driver of the increase, one of the key driver is the significant overlap between stress testing and the new Basel framework, including the duplicative capitalization for market and operational risk. We can get into a little more detail after this, but I'm hopeful that given I know that many of my former colleagues at the agencies are keeping an open mind going into this proposal, and they are concerned with the impact of the overall impact of proposal as well. But what they need is evidence-based justification for any adjustment that they may make, and I'm very hopeful for that. The final rule could include evidence-based adjustment to mitigate the impact, and I myself, working with my colleagues, trying to contribute to that process. So I know it's a long remark, but forgive me because it's a hugely important topic.
Thank you. With that, I'll move to you, David, to talk a little bit about this proposal. It does have a major revamp for how capital requirements are structured and applied in banking organizations. What's your view about what's the macro impact going to be on the industry? What are the types of changes that we could see in how banks organize themselves, the types of activities they engage in, potential for mergers as a result of the proposal?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and talk to you about some of these things. I think that one of the implications of the proposal is particularly stark for mid-sized banks. A lot of what's going to happen with the Basel III Endgame, if it's implemented as proposed, is that the very largest banks are going to face, a plethora of additional capital requirements and different kinds of measurements. But one of them, and that's consequential for them. But one of the things that's novel about the proposal is that a sort of mid-sized banking sector in particular is going to be sort of pulled into the approach that's being taken for our largest banks in a way that's going to treat them as a regulatory matter a lot like the largest banks. So they're going to have to mark to market their available for sale securities. Their approach to counterparty credit risk is going to match that of the largest banks. They're going to apply a variety of GSIB risk measures to mid-sized banks. And mid-sized banks are going to have to make the sorts of disclosures that large banks have to make. So all of that has the potential to really change the mid-sized banking sector, which, to be sure, went through its own sort of blip earlier this year. It was mid-sized banks that failed, and maybe the mid-sized bank failures is one of the things that's driven the way that this proposal has ended up looking like. But those banks are going to find it harder to operate with these new capital requirements, and one of the implications of that is they might sort of get bigger or disappear. And if they disappear, that would be through mergers and acquisitions. And that has a couple of different implications. One is, we want competitors to exist to the largest banks that are around in the United States. And the place where that competition has been coming from in the past is largely from the mid-sized sector, the PNCs, the Truists of the world, who are sort of getting larger and trying to play with the big boys. But secondly, I think there are some real world implications for an increasingly stressed mid-sized banking sector. They're pretty important regulators, or they're pretty important providers of lending for commercial real estate, a troubled sector that needs access to capital and has often found it through these sort of mid-tier of banks. And they do a lot of sort of Main Street lending to small and medium business enterprises. And I think one of the things that we worry about economically is, where are we going to get that kind of commercial lending, mid-sized business lending? And it's come from these banks that are going to be put under, I think, regulatory pressure from these requirements. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible that it's worth it, right? We don't want Silicon Valley Bank to come along every year or something like that. But any sort of effort to sort of turn these regionals into banks that are regulated the way that JP Morgan is regulated, I think is likely to force the regionals to, again, either get a lot bigger so they can sort of compete with JP Morgan, or to sort of exit the space through merger or shrinkage or something like that.
Let me just do a follow-up question on there. So one of the rationales for the proposals that'll address potential systemic risk coming from the banking sector by having higher capital requirements. What's your view about that, the validity of that thesis, that this is necessarily a positive for reducing systemic risk? Or are there ways that, as you just discussed, changes in the banking sector may actually make the proposal actually could increase systemic risk?
It definitely concentrates that risk in a few institutions. And I think for better or for worse, that sort of has been the way that American regulators have thought about financial risk since the financial crisis. You know, there's an effort to create in derivatives, financial market utilities that have all the risk piled in there, and then hopefully those utilities are going to be well managed. There's been an effort to sort of make sure that the largest banks are very, very carefully supervised and very, very capitally, provided for as far as it goes for capital. And there's this concern that that by sort of creating a system where there's a few really big institutions that are carefully watched, but mistakes can happen, events can occur, and no one knows where the next crisis is going to come from. That there's a lack of diversification in the system, and a possibility that that these really huge, really systemically important institutions, that something could go wrong for one of them, and that could be really, really dramatically impactful for financial stability.
I want to move to Matt now to kind of follow up on that. Is one of the other major changes to the capital requirements is going to be the inclusion of a new operational risk component. Matt, would you walk us through, give us the high-level view of what the operational risk capital requirement is, how it functions, and particularly if you could focus on what types of activities are likely to be impacted most by the proposal?
Yes, of course, Andrew. And I think that operational risk is something that's going to be new to most of the people in this room and listening in, that we're all familiar with credit risk, or the risk of people not paying on their loans. We're also familiar with market risk. That's the stock market going up and down, or changes in asset prices. But we often don't think about operational risk, which is what I call the risk of something bad happening. That operational risk includes things like a teller stealing money out of the drawer in the branch, or a hacker disabling the ATM network, or, God forbid, a hurricane wiping out a branch. And so those kinds of operational risks aren't necessarily what we do in our transactional lives here, but the regulators in the proposal would elevate the operational risk to basically be co-equal with the other risk stripes, and expand the requirements to hold capital against it to all of the 100 billion plus banks. This change has a number of issues with it. That one is it's not clear to me that operational risk needs an independent capital charge, because it's not necessarily correlated with the other risks. That capital is fungible, that the same capital I hold against potential credit losses can be used to rebuild the branch after a hurricane. And so it's not clear to me that we need to hold separate capital for that operational risk, because just because a hurricane comes through and takes out the branch doesn't necessarily mean the stock market will go down and hit my trading book. But putting aside that correlation issue, the regulators are proposing an elegantly complex formula that probably Dr. Zhang and I would love doing. You guys wouldn't necessarily love it. But it has a number of risk drivers that determine a bank's operational risk capital requirements. And the one that really sticks out here is probably the most significant driver is the fee-based income. That a bank would have to look at its income and revenues from fee-generating activities, or non-interest income generating activities, and use that income to set the operational risk capital requirements. It's effectively a capital requirement on a revenue item. So you're mixing the balance sheet with the income statement. And it would come in, there'd really be no limit to the amount of fee income that would be included in the formula. For the last 10 years or so, I think the pressure from regulators has been for banks to increase their fee generating income. That the message has been, well, if you have a steady stream of fee and service revenue, then you're not subject to the vagaries of interest rate changes and the market. And so if you have a steady stream of recurring fee revenue, that's better. And the op risk part of the proposal turns that on its head and now says, well, the more fee generating revenue and income you have, that's going to increase your capital charge. This is particularly significant for the mid-sized banks that the Professor Zaring was talking about, because they have not had to hold capital against this risk before, and they do have significant fee income from things like fiduciary activities, securities brokerage, issuing letters of credit, the fee that's paid for a letter of credit, loan servicing for third-party loan servicing activities, securitization-related gains and losses, all types of that fee income. And what's interesting is it hits different banks in different ways, that there are some mid-sized banks that are heavily focused in the credit card sector, and so they get hit by the inclusion of interchange fees and annual fees on credit cards. Then you have other banks who are focused on loan servicing of, say, auto loan portfolios or other portfolios held by third parties. And so they get hit by the loan servicing revenue piece. And then you have others who are focused on retail securities brokerage or underwriting activities for in the institutional space, and they get hit by that part. And you even have a couple who are big insurance commission brokers, and they broker insurance to their customers, and those insurance commission revenues and insurance brokerage revenues are included. So really every bank is getting hit in a different way in the mid-sized space. And one quote that I like is from Jamie Dimon a couple weeks ago. Is he says, "Are all revenues equally bad?" No offense to you, Professor. What person in an ivory tower thinks that's a rational thing to do? And he's getting at the point that all of these different revenue streams that I just described have different risks associated with them, that some scale up and some are not particularly risky. And so why are all of them getting thrown in this bucket to drive up banks' operational risk capital requirements? And I think that's the question people are going to put to the regulators in the comment process.
And Matt, let me give you a follow-up. Based on what you said there, it's striking because in the late 90s, right, Congress passed a statute, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley bill, which was designed to encourage banks to or allow them to adopt a financial supermarket approach, where you could go to a bank and you could receive everything from a deposit and checking account to investment advice to insurance. It sounds like what you're saying there with the change in operational risk. Now there's going to be a negative capital charge for banks pursuing that type of approach going forward.
So, yes, there definitely will be the negative capital charge for the financial supermarket. And there also will be, though, an implementation cost that I think is getting understated by many, that as you noted, there are these now sprawling organizations that offer many types of products and services to their customers. And in isolation, each product has to justify its cost of capital. And it does roll up into an enterprise-wide risk management system, but the proposal would require banks to track these income and revenue items, these operational loss events at a very granular level, to quantify them with a level of accounting precision that maybe we haven't seen before. In some cases, as one person pointed out, they were like, that math is something I didn't study in college. And I was like, yeah, that's true. And so, for the Dr. Zings of the world, there will be a great employment bill for you to develop these approaches to capture and quantify all of these operational items. But for mid-sized banks, having to hold capital against this and hire the Dr. Zangs of the world to design new systems, I think that's going to be a huge disincentive to offer these diversified product sets, Andrew.
Yeah, just want to add a few more words on what Matt has discussed, which I totally agree. First, let me start with Andrew mentioned the objective of the Basel III Endgame. At the international level, the objective is not to increase capital. Instead, it's used to mitigate or to reduce the variability of capital requirement produced based on the internal models framework. And therefore, as you can see, the new framework set a lot of stringent requirement on banks' use of their internal developed models. And the reason if we can take one step further back, if we look at the global financial crises, I think it's general consensus that that crisis showed banks' capital is not enough. Therefore, the Basel Committee designed a number of patchwork to increase the capital requirement, and that's achieved under the current Basel III framework. When it comes to market risk, that's called Basel 2.5. And the stage of capital increase already passed. It's achieved the increasing capital by about 3 times relative to where banks were during the financial crisis. Now, the next stage is this Basel III Endgame approach. This stage is trying to achieve level playing field, cross jurisdiction, and therefore supervisors have a reliable information to assess banks' riskiness as measured by the capital requirement. And that's the objective. Increased capital is not one of them. Now, related to operational risk, the reason we are seeing the huge capital impact that we mentioned earlier in the US proposal, I say the first category comes from the Basel Endgame's calibration. But there, if we look at aggregate cross-jurisdictional level, the calibration is just Basel Committee has done quantitative impact analysis twice every year. That most recent analysis shows on aggregate, the Basel III Endgame leading to roughly 3% capital increase, not 20, not 75. And in the US proposal, there are a number of, I'll call US specific components, or often called gold-plated components. And the stress testing, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the components, and these to capital increase. Another component was related to operational risk, as Matt just discussed. In the Basel framework, there is what's called the internal loss multiplier. The objective of that, call it a lever that regulators can pull. The objective of that lever is trying to set the right incentive for banks to manage their operational risk. If you don't do a good job managing your operational risk, you likely will have huge losses and perhaps frequent losses that increase your loss history. That loss history in and of itself will lead to an internal loss multiplier of a larger number. That number is used to scale up the capital requirements. So if you don't do a good job, as you can expect, your corporate capital will increase. But on the other hand, if you do a good job, you don't have a lot of losses or material losses, that multiplier, at least based on Basel standards design objective, can go down, can go below 1. In other words, if you do a good job, you expect to see capital reduce.
I'm just watching the.
But what the NPR does is to floor that multiplier at 1. In other words, if you do a good job, you got no benefit. But if you do a bad job, you penalize, which appropriately, if you do a bad job, you expect to see capital increase. But you do a good job, it doesn't matter. So it's not entirely clear what is the objective that parameter is trying to achieve in the NPR.
Let me build on your comments about how the U.S. has taken a different approach internationally, and maybe Guowei, have you follow up and then have David respond as well, get his thoughts about what this is going to do to the international competitiveness of U.S. institutions abroad, but also the interest in foreign banking organizations in wanting to be part of the U.S. markets.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I rather compare a U.S. Proposed approach with the Basel internationally agreed standards, and then I'll let the professor to talk more about the different jurisdiction perspective. I think comparing between the U.S. proposal and the international agreed standards, there are a lot of components. Even today, it's far more stringent than the Basel standard. Take the 8 GSIB, for example. There is so-called GSIB surcharge. The Basel agreed approach, there is a Basel agreed approach. In the US, it's called Method 1. And then there is a US specific approach called Method 2. That method too has a lot of issues. Give you an example. The Basel standard method 1 is based on a market share. There are a bunch of indicators. For each indicator, you as a GSIB, depending on, you look at your competitors globally, where you say in terms of market share with respect to that, that indicator. As long as your market share don't change over the years, your capital charge don't change. That's the idea of method 1. Look at US method 2. The method 2 is based on absolute level. As long as the economy grows, even if you keep saying market share, your absolute number goes up. That automatically leads to capital requirement goes up. And so that's one example of the US scope splitting. There are a number of others. I mentioned earlier the internal loss multiplier regarding the operational risk. And then when it comes to FRTB or the new market risk, and the Basel standard offers a modeled approach for one of the components called default risk charge. The US didn't implement that, requires standardized approach. Standardized approach generally leads to higher requirement in modeled approach. More importantly, especially for the mega banks who have a pretty large credit portfolio, the Basel Endgame offers internal models approach to set the capital requirement for your banking book. It's called the internal rating-based approach. The US completely got rid of it, only implemented standardized approach. And standardized approach, if you look at the NPR, standardized approach compared to the modeled approach, which are allowed now, but in forward, it will be removed. That alone increased capital requirement to the tune of about $1.5 trillion.
David?
I just wanted to give you a real ivory tower perspective. So Jamie Dimon's going to love this. So the Basel Committee was created after a couple of small banks sort of collapsed in different ways. One was a German bank that was seized by regulators before its payments in New York had settled a currency crisis. And this relatively small German bank created a large payments crisis that extended to New York and London and created a lot of problems for American financial institutions. And then an American bank that was owned by somebody with an interest in Italian banking, the Franklin National Bank, also collapsed because of some subsidies that the American bank was providing for its foreign counterpart that American regulators didn't really know about. So American regulators realized that banking had gone global and there needed to be some sort of global response to that. So they created, with the support of European and some Asian banking regulators, the Basel Committee. And eventually they concluded that one of the ways that this international banking sector could be regulated is by creating a level playing field for capital adequacy, something that would increase the capital requirements of foreign banks. And that offered something to American banks as well, the opportunity to compete on the same regulatory standard with their foreign counterparts, both at home and abroad. And so I think there's some concern that the benefits of this level playing field, which got some industry buy-in and contributed to an environment where American banks could really succeed abroad, that this level playing field could be lost if the American banking regulators depart in substantial ways from what Basel requires. The goal was to deal with globalization by creating global standards that would apply to everyone. And while I understand worries about bank safety and stuff like that, there's some possibility that some of those advantages can be lost if American banking regulators go their own way and sort of turn away from this sort of global standard that creates the level playing field that American banks have benefited from.
Yeah, Matt, want to follow up?
If I could just add, one of the things I think that's interesting in this debate that Professor Zering raised is that we often talk about, oh, well, this change would create an unlevel playing field because it would increase the requirement for say, US banks versus European banks, or it would increase the requirements for the US G-SIBs versus the smaller banks. And what seems to be absent, at least from my reading of the NPR, was any question of, well, is this even the right place to be starting from? That should we be going down for some of the other banks, and actually that the playing field, the current playing field, is too high? And I think a really good example of that is in the mortgage sector, that the proposal says, oh, we're going to take the Basel Committee's new risk weights for residential mortgages, and we're going to increase each of them by 20%. So we're going to raise the scale from, right now in the Basel Committee, it's risk weights of 40 to 105. And in the US, we're going to up it so that it goes up to 125. And the reason put forward is, oh, we want to maintain a level playing field between the 100 billion plus banks and the smaller banks in the US. And it would be, if we followed the Basel Committee's approach, it would give the larger US banks an edge over the smaller US banks. And I look at that and I say, maybe that's true, but isn't the counterpoint that we should be lowering the requirements for the smaller US banks? That if it's the Basel Committee thinks that the right level playing field is this lower number for the larger banks, then shouldn't everyone benefit from it? And why are we assuming that the right response is to just increase everyone to this higher US gold plating standard when Basel has said that silver is good?
Matt, I want to follow up with you on that and talk. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the changes in the proposal and that would impact securitization, which I know can be pretty technical here. Yeah. But also can have a particularly significant impact on banks' ability to manage their risks. So can you walk us through how the proposal impacts securitization?
Yeah, so there's a number of changes for securitization, which I won't bore the audience with, but the largest one is there's a formula. When a bank does a securitization, it puts the assets into some vehicle or some other way to transfer portions of the risk to other parties. And that allows the bank to, on its retained piece of the risk, have less exposure to the whole portfolio. And that's a credit risk mitigant. And that's the basic concept of securitization. And the Basel Committee has developed a formula that actually quantifies this based on things like tranche thickness, based on the underlying attributes of the pool of assets, based on what is being sold and the terms it's being sold on. And so there is an elegant formula. And embedded in this formula is what is called the P factor. And the P factor is much like Professor Zhang was saying about in the operational setting, it's a multiplier. And it's not a perfect multiplier, but it does go up and down. And right now in the US, it's set to 0.5. The proposal would increase that to 1.0, so effectively doubling it. And this is a problem for a number of reasons, that it wouldn't necessarily double capital requirements for securitization exposures, but it would greatly increase them, meaning that banks would have a disincentive to securitize their assets and transfer that first loss portion of the risk to those in the market who are probably better able to bear it. The other part, though, is that when you drill down on what the P factor is meant to measure, and I've been oblique about this for a reason, is that it's meant to measure the risk of uncertainty in the whole capital framework. So the risk that the regulators got it wrong when they assigned different risk weights to all of the individual exposures. The whole framework it's meant to be a conservatism factor to account for that risk. And so I think it's striking that in a proposal where the regulators are touting that it is they're assigning more granular risk weights, it's based on all of these years of analytical experience from the post-financial crisis, and everything is going to be much more precise. But then in the securitization framework, we take the opposite tact and the regulators say, but we're going to increase the likelihood that we got it wrong by increasing the conservatism P factor. So I think in the securitization setting, that is a major issue. And in Europe, there are at least strong rumors indicating that Europe will be keeping their P factor at 0.5. So their banks will not have that increased capital effect on their securitizations. And so I think that is really the biggest driver in the securitization debate. There's other things like penalization of excess spread, and also saying, just because Director McKernan is here, that the proposal does not address the issue around synthetic securitizations with credit-linked notes. That while the Fed was generous enough to give us some FAQs last week that are positive, there is a question of this. There's a particular type of securitization that the industry has been clamoring for at least half a decade. There are active deals in the marketplace. There are many deals in Europe, and somehow this rather notable change in market practice doesn't make it into the proposal, and so I question that choice as well.
Before I move to the audience for questions, let me just turn quickly to the long-term debt proposal, which is in a normal year would be the focus of all of our attention, but because it came out shortly after the Basel Endgame proposal, has I think unfortunately not received as much of attention. Let me just throw it open to the panel. What are your thoughts about the long-term debt requirement proposal, and where are we likely to see its biggest impacts?
Yeah, I mean, I can happy to start. On the long-term debt proposal, as you know, the GSIBs are currently subject to the requirement, that long-term debt requirement and TLAC requirement. And the new proposal might mostly loop in the other relatively smaller banks, those with total assets greater than 100 billion, but not GSIBs. And the proposals estimated that the overall new issuance as a result of the rule around $250 billion. And that's in competition with Treasury issuance. I brought a couple of charts here, and not sure if you guys can see this. At least the trend line is going up. That's based on this year's budget. Basically says, if you look at 2022, the federal budget is slightly below 1.4 trillion. If you look at we're looking at over 2 trillion. So a solid 50% increase, and that's the direction it's going. And this chart shows the maturity bucket of the new Treasury issuance. Perhaps you can only see green, the green bars. Those are bills. So as you can see, all the new issuance maturely dominated by bill issue, Treasury bills. As you all know, bills need to be refinanced within a year. And so in order for the successful refinancing by the Treasury Department, what we need is a liquid capital market, especially liquid and deep Treasury market. What we have seen recently on a study published by the New York Fed in late August, what they convincingly shown, dealers' balance sheet capacity is constrained by capital. If you have higher, especially during stress condition, if you have higher capital, dealers has less ability of intermediate capital market, including Treasury market. The result is Treasury market illiquidity. So I'm a little concerned that going forward, perhaps if the proposal got implemented along with other proposals, we perhaps will see diminished capital market liquidity, including Treasury market.
David, on long-term debt.
Sure, I would. I'll take a little more of a legal tack to it. I don't have those great charts that you have there, but one thing that's striking to me about the long-term debt proposal is that it admits that if this were done, it wouldn't have prevented the failure of the U.S. regional banks earlier this year. The regulators are open in admitting that even if the banks had issued all of this long-term debt that they would have been required, it would not have saved the banks, that the runs were just too great, the problems were too large, and it still would have taken them down. And so the regulators' justification seems to be, well, it might have given us longer to figure out what to do, that rather than having a weekend to figure out how to sell the bank, we might have had a couple of weeks to do it. And that kind of optionality, particularly, I think it's most evident in the proposal where it talks about having internal long-term debt issued from banks to their holding companies, and it recognizes really that has almost no effect on saving a bank. It just gives the regulators more optionality in deciding what to do once a bank has failed. Do you recapitalize the holding company? Do you split off and sell the bank? That it gives them more options. And so when we're talking about imposing these tremendous costs on the banks to issue this long-term debt, to fund it, and then also as Dr. Zhang said, to the crowding out effect that it would have on the broader market, if the benefit we're getting from it is we could have a few more meetings for in a couple of more weeks in March, I'm not really sure if that is worth the cost. If you could tell me, look, if we make these changes, we will never have another mid-sized bank that fails. Or if you could point to what happened in Switzerland and say, hey, look, this worked perfectly. We were able to preserve two G-SIBs in Switzerland. The whole bail-in process was seamless. Then maybe I'd say that it was worth the cost. But when the outcome is we can have a few more conference calls, I'm really not convinced that it's worth the cost.
Well, or maybe this would be a question follow-up for David then is, since Matt points out the proposal is really not designed to prevent failures, but to insulate uninsured depositors from taking losses, do we now effectively have universal deposit insurance in this country?
I mean, that'd be really controversial. And then you're getting into some of the administrative law aspects of this proposal, which I'd be interested in. You know, if the regulators extend deposit insurance to everybody, that's not something that Congress has suggested they should do. That's the kind of major question that I think the courts are increasingly looking at carefully. And what they'd be looking to see is did Congress directly advise the regulators that they ought to take this step with deposit insurance? And it's not clear to me that the answer would be yes. More generally, one of the things about both of these proposals that I'm interested in seeing is it looks like the banks may sue the regulators over these final rules. And that's something that really rarely happens. Banks never sue their regulators. Sometimes it looks like a terrible dynamic. There seems to be some concern that they'll be retaliated against by their supervisors. And that doesn't seem like non-arbitrary government action if that's the threat. And I'm interested to see what they base it on. Cost-benefit analysis is something you expect to see in these kinds of lawsuits, especially with the lawyers that the Bank Policy Institute has engaged. So far, they're emphasizing data availability and sort of an inconsistency with the tailoring rules that Congress passed in Agrippa. So we'll see what happens, but it would be really interesting and pretty unprecedented if banks took that step for such a major rule like this one. And so, once again, from the perspective of the ivory tower, I'm excited to see what would happen.
Let's go quickly to some questions.
Maybe more of an observation, but it feels like to a certain degree that there's a division between an attempt to prevent bank failure and what happens in the event of bank failure. So to prevent bank failure, you're creating rules that will strengthen the largest banks and drive assets out of the regulated financial system off balance sheet. In the moment of resolution, the regulators explicitly want mid-sized banks to be the buyers because they're concerned about the concentration of assets in those banks. So how do you reconcile pulling in two different directions at the same time? I mean, I could probably argue that we have too many mid-sized banks, but that's clearly never been the view of the regulatory authorities when it comes to bank resolution. Who adjudicates that tension?
David, you want to handle that one?
I mean, I take the comment under advisement. I mean, I think it's a good point. My usual riff on this is that one of the things that was most notable about the response to Silicon Valley is that it wasn't sold immediately. Conditional on what Matt said, if what you want to do is dispose of a bank in a weekend, then you really want everybody to be able to come to the market to do that. And if there's some sort of sub silentio approach by regulators by saying, well, we don't mean everybody should come and buy these banks. We just mean PNC, then I think that's something that should be made explicit, and I think it should also be, justified in some way. So
I have time for one last question. Tom?
The conversation about operational risk and the capital charge is very interesting. Was that an example of gold plating by the US regulator? And are there any business dynamics between the European community and the American community that makes this just more onerous on the US banks?
Yeah, this definitely is one of the examples of the U.S. gold plating. There are many others currently even and in the proposal. I think again, as the Basel standards we just discussed, the whole point of Basel standards is trying to set or achieve a level playing field, and gold plating definitely or less likely to achieve that objective.
Well, with that, I want to thank our panel for joining us today and the wonderful discussion. If everyone would please give a round of applause for our wonderful panel.